Hello everyone, Daryl Pritchard here as I show you my astrophotography setup. In particular, what we are looking at is a Nikon D850 DSLR, a Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter contemporary zoom lens, a ZWO 120 millimeter focal length guide scope with ZWO 120 mm-S, I believe it's called, auto guiding camera, mounted on a Star Adventurer Pro star tracker from Skywatcher. Now, I'll touch on this later, but this is not the mount as you would receive it because I have replaced its wedge already with a more high precision wedge. The Pro package does come with the green Vixen style dovetail plate that you see attached here, to which is attached an extension arm for a 1 kilogram counterweight or 2.2 pound counterweight. And the reason for this presentation is not so much a do as I say or do as I do video, as more of a if you do what I did, then you may need to do what I had to, if that makes sense. It turned out that I was not aware that for star trackers, they will have a maximum rated payload capacity, the payload being anything you add to them basically in addition to whatever they are provided with. So in this case, the Star Adventurer is rated at a 5.5 pound payload capacity, although if you buy the fine-tuning assembly with dovetail plate and counterweight, that doubles its capacity to support up to 11 pounds. So I thought, okay, my camera and lens together weigh about 7 pounds with this dovetail plate, and then the ZWO guide scope and camera, as well as the Arca Swiss clamp that I've got here. All of that together weighs about just under 9 pounds total. So 11 pounds versus 9, that wasn't a lot of margin for error or what have you, but it was enough. And I thought, okay, I'm new to this hobby. I don't want to be spending a lot on expensive tracking mounts, equatorial mounts. So this will let me get my feet wet. And if I really decide I want to do more, I'll upgrade to a better mount later. What I didn't know is that for whatever the specified max payload capacity is, it is highly recommended that you not exceed 50% of that as your actual payload. The reason being is that the trackers do have gears in them and motors, and they're going to be struggling to carry whatever weight you put on them, and clearly the more weight you have, the more they are going to struggle and potentially wear out sooner. But perhaps even more important is the tracking that the tracker provides you may be more prone to errors because it's, again, it's just fighting all of that weight. So 9 pounds of gear on a tracker rated for 11 pounds, which really should not be carrying more than 5.5. Okay, we're 3.5 pounds overweight. But I decided, okay, so be it. I'm going to see what I can do to optimize this as much as I can for this particular camera and lens, which is my heaviest combination, and hopefully I'll get some good results. I can say that with time and practice, I have gotten to the point that I have successfully achieved a capture of 2.5 minute exposures with minimal star trails, perhaps none at all, although initially I was having some star trails. And that gets me back to what you see right here. This William Optics high latitude, I believe it's called wedge. This is a precision machined aluminum wedge that, although the Star Adventurer Pro's wedge was still a pretty decent one, it was a combination of plastic and metal parts. And whenever I was making my adjustments for the azimuth and elevation, there was enough slop in the controls that it was very easy to, bump a little bit and go too far one way or another. And getting that fine polar alignment was difficult. And when you're fighting a tracker that you know itself is going to be fighting to provide you accurate tracking, then absolutely you want the most accurate polar alignment possible. So I decided I'd spend the extra money and get this wedge. This was about $200, and that's on a tracker that itself was, I don't know, $400 or $450. So half the cost of this tracker is now being spent on that wedge, and it's kind of crazy. I should have taken that total $600 to $700 and just simply gone and put that toward a nicer, higher weight rated equatorial mount. But live and learn. Hopefully you'll learn from what I'm telling you. But in any case, I bought the new wedge, and that did improve how precisely I could perform my polar alignment, because once I fine-tuned the positions using the smaller screws here on each side, the locking levers and the precision of how well this is made was such that as I tightened down the locking levers so that alignment would be held through the night without much issue, they didn't cause as much of a shift in those established positions as I had observed with the original wedge. So I do get better results using that wedge. Now, taking it a step further, as I say, I was using an auto guider camera and guide scope, and with a laptop running the PhD2 auto guiding software, I was getting some pretty good polar alignments, but I was still seeing star trails. So I decided, okay, let's take things up a notch higher, and I bought a ZWO ASIR Pro imaging controller. And this replaces the laptop in PhD2. It's just a little black box, if you will, that has an interface that is providing a on-screen presentation of your alignment process, as well as then later setting up your image capture process by way of using a smartphone or tablet. As you see, my tablet here is set up. So on that screen there, which is used for performing a polar alignment, it will present me a reticle representing the reticle of my polar scope of the tracker, and a reference to Polaris, NCP, the Northern Celestial Pole Star. So instead of even having to reference my polar scope by looking through the finder, I now have an on-screen presentation. I dial in my settings using my wedge, and once everything is nice and accurate, I tighten that down and I'm good to go with my imaging session for the night. So that totally gets me away from even having to use the polar scope. Now, that being said, I do want to point out, with the Star Adventurer Pro, the single worst thing about this tracker is the polar scope illuminator they provide. It does not have an internal illuminator, as should be the case, but instead they give you a little small plastic bracket that will fit into the slot of this Vixen Dovetail, and into that bracket you put this little plastic polar scope illuminator. And it drives you nuts because it's just so prone to falling out of that slot and not staying in place. So if you do happen to buy a Star Adventurer Pro, my recommendation is store away your polar scope illuminator and buy a Night Eyes micro light. This is a button cell powered flashlight with 2 intensity levels, and you can get them in different color LEDs. So I got one that was a red LED. So you've got a bright setting and a dimmer setting, and then it's got a strobe. If you click through them, you get the 3 settings. If you wait too long, it just stays at that setting. But it turns off after 4 minutes, and if you can't get your polar alignment performed within 4 minutes, you just tap the button and you've got 4 more minutes to work with. But the beauty of this is you can put a strip of Velcro on your Vixen Dovetail plate, some Velcro on the back side of the flashlight, and then simply tack it to the Dovetail plate, and that Velcro is going to hold it far more securely than the original Illuminator ever was. And you don't want to aim it down your polar scope's sighting tube because it will be too bright for that, but you can just simply let the light bounce off of some other part of your mount, and the deflected light is enough to still provide adequate illumination of the polar scope. So that's my first upgrade recommendation for a Star Adventurer. Ditch its polar scope illuminator and use a micro light. Another thing that has been mentioned as a small issue with the Star Adventurer Pro is this side mode knob. It's relatively easy to knock it out of adjustment if you were getting too careless with your handling. Maybe you can get some sense of there. It turns so very easily. And it has an off position such that it could be that, being this is a battery-powered device in some cases, if you were to dismount this and disassemble it, put it into a travel storage case, and not realize it, you might actually accidentally bump that switch to an on position. And when you get wherever you're going, you find out your batteries are used up, if they were weak to begin with, or if you traveled too far, whatever. Anyway, point is, a very simple fix for this is take some self-adhesive Velcro, put a square on each side of the knob, and one even on top of the knob, I think is useful. Then with another piece of self-adhesive Velcro, I had some industrial strength Velcro, which works great, and I removed the protective backing and cut a strip of duct tape and just applied that over the adhesive. So now I've got a good little Velcro strap, and you just tack that down on one square, go across the knob and tack it to the other, and you've got a very simple and effective solution to help prevent accidentally positioning your switch the wrong position. Meanwhile, you can actually leave that in place, and since you're only having to go one detent to the on position for celestial tracking, it will still allow you to do that. But to go any further, it starts seizing up on the Velcro, so that serves its purpose very nicely. What else? Oh, on the other side, if you're not using batteries, which I've gotten away from, and instead you're using USB power, the port of the Star Adventurer Pro is not going to very securely hold your standard. I believe this is the standard USB mini size plug. I've had that fall out numerous times. So what I do there is I've just simply got a rubber band that I loop that around the cable, run the rubber band around the Star Adventurer, and then slip the other end of the band back over the end of the cable. So it's being tugged at, in essence, from each side by the rubber band. And that creates enough tension on that USB cord that it's not going anywhere. And that has worked fabulously. I never have a cable come loose anymore. What else? Okay. This is the big reason why I bought the Star Adventurer Pro over a competitive Ioptron Skyguider Pro. One, it was a little bit less expensive, but secondly is that on this dovetail plate, it has a 3/8 inch mounting stud down toward the end. And what that has allowed me to do is attach, after I first put on a small offset post, let me loosen this up here, I attached a small 25mm Arca Swiss dovetail plate. It's actually upside down, but that works fine for this particular use. And what that lets me do now is my guide scope, this ZWO guide scope, came with a small dovetail plate attached to where you see this double ball arm now is connected. So I removed the dovetail plate that was on it, connected this small rig double ball arm, and at the other end of that arm then I purchased and added another small 25mm Arca Swiss clamp. So that clamp now secures to the plate that's mounted to the Vixen plate and allows me to securely mount my guide scope at a point that is better for my situation. And I clarify that because I kind of stole this idea from Peter Zelenka. The difference being that Peter, in one of his videos where he's discussing mounts, he shows that he has an L bracket on his camera. And I do have an L bracket for my D850, but that's just more weight added to it. But what Peter did was, with that L bracket, coming over and then up the side, but with a clamp instead of a Vixen plate on the scope, he could put that clamp and mount it directly to the side of his camera, still have room to work with his cables, and have his guide scope right up here. Very nice, elegant solution. But the problem is, for me, this camera and lens combination I'm working with, it was probably another pound heavier than even what Peter had. And I just decided that, okay, I'm already going over the rated weight capacity of this mount. So the way I can be gentler on the mount is make sure that any extra weight that I have to strap on there goes below the center of gravity of the camera and lens that's on there, and ideally below the polar axis of the tracker. So in doing that, what I now have is that the guide scope and camera actually help contribute a little bit of weight to the total counterweighting that will offset my camera. Now, that works. It works very well. I do recommend it as an option. But in my case, it was still not quite enough to balance this heavy camera combination. Now, as far as the weight there goes, I'll point out what we're talking about is the lens, the camera, and although it's not really needed at the moment, I've got a 100mm Dovetail plate attached to the bottom. That probably adds another, 2 ounces. But then we have the 140mm Dovetail plate of the lens, and that is fitted into a Arca Swiss panning base. This was the, other than just a standard clamp, which can be a quite low profile clamp in and of itself, this one gives me the ability to do a panoramic adjustment or panning adjustment of the camera. In essence, it really duplicates the functionality of the fine-tuning assembly of the Star Adventurer Pro. Just by flipping this knob, I can now position it very easily in declination rather than reaching under here and loosening the declination clutch. But it also gives me a scale that I can use to reference relative to a separate scale that I made and taped to the face of the fine-tuning assembly base. In any case, you've got the weight of the clamp, of the dovetail, the lens, the camera, all of that contributing to the payload that we're concerned about the total weight of. So to balance that, not only do I need the weight of the provided 1 kilogram counterweight, the weight of the added ball arm and camera with auto guide, or guide scope with auto guide or camera, but I also still needed a little more weight. And the way I first, I guess you could say I needed more weight. I needed more force to offset the weight of the camera in balancing it. And the way I first achieved that was I found some aluminum rods on Amazon that were exactly the same as this chrome steel arm that comes with the mount, but they were aluminum, and they were pre-bored with a 5mm bore, which happened to be just perfect to tap for an M6 thread, which is what this arm uses. So by using a M6 bolt screwed into the extension arm and cutting that off, I was able to double this extension out another 300mm. But what that meant, even though it worked, and by positioning the 1 kilogram weight all the way down here, I was able to balance my camera. But it creates such a bigger torque so far out here away from the mount that I just thought it was going to be harder on the motors and gears of the mount. So I ditched the idea of extending the weight and instead just adding a little more weight at a shorter distance, still on the same extension arm. So this is my other upgrade that I made. I found some galvanized pipe fittings at a local hardware store, drilled a hole through the cap through which I could then thread an M6 bolt that's 60mm long, run that through this bushing, and this bushing holds a large fender washer in place inside that cap. And there you can maybe just barely see it. And underneath that fender washer is a rubber gasket to kind of help fill in the hole of the washer, and 300 BBs. So all that screwed together gives me almost right at a 1 pound counterweight that becomes a fixed weight at the end of the extension arm, and then by simply adjusting the movable weight, I can very easily get a nice counterbalance system set up with this camera. And it's even better than when I had only the single weight out at the far arm. The balancing is a much more controlled swing, a much more gradual rate. So that is my Star Adventurer Pro and problems I ran into it, but which have, with the changes I've made, allowed me to use it, at least for the time being, until it wears out on me, to capture some longer time exposures with a heavier payload than really what is recommended for use with it. So I hope you find that helpful. I wish you clear skies.